At 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent and what used to be called the Great War, we know as the First World War, ended. The 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. Every year in the UK, we have Remembrance Day and Remembrance Sunday to remember all the people that gave their lives in that war and all the subsequent wars, of course, including World War II. Now, this is the small town of Wigston, Magna, in Leicestershire, which, if you're looking from outside the UK, is Central County in England. And there is the plaque they made after the First World War with the men who fell during that conflict. Wigston is a vibrant town today. It's very looked on as almost as a suburb of the city of Leicester, but during the Great War it was more a distinct town on its own with fields in between. Population today is around 32,000 plus, but during the First World War it was around 9,000. So what we're going to look at today is an area we call Memorial Park, and then just talk about three brothers who died in the First World War. And as we do the walk, you'll see that there's poppies everywhere. Again, if you're from outside the UK, why they've been shown? Well, that's the national emblem of remembrance, the poppy. The traditional poppy is the one we're seeing in red, which is organised by the Royal British Legion, and people give money, collections are held, and that money goes to the charity of ex-servicemen and all their families. And there's still plenty today that need their help from the more recent wars, of course. Why the poppy? Well, the poppy was well known for growing on the battlefields of France and Flanders in northern Belgium, because the shell fire had churned up the ground, the constant bombardment had churned the ground up, bringing the seeds up to the surface, and then the nitrogen from the shells helped fertilise them. And of course, not least, we had lots of dead humans in no man's land, and of course dead animals, horses, etc. So after the First World War, the poppy became the symbol of sacrifice, and it's still the same to this day, but this goes for all wars, of course, not just the First World War. So as we walk along the street in Wigston, you'll see that the council have now put them up in view of it's going to be Remembrance Day shortly. Remembrance Day is on the actual day of the 11th of November, but then the main ceremonies are held on Remembrance Sunday, the nearest Sunday to the date, with a very large ceremony going on in London at the cenotaph with the royal family and the politicians, but throughout the country, every town and city like Wigston will be holding their own ceremony. In Leicestershire, in the county, 12,000 men lost their lives during the Great War, and I'm just going to focus on the Great War for a moment rather than all the different numbers. In the UK in total, something like 900,000 men lost their lives, 744,000 in battle. If we extend that to the then empire, with countries like Australia and India and New Zealand, etc., that goes up to 1.2 million killed. Top of that, of course, you've got all the other casualties of the time. I also will just show another building here as I swing the camera around for a totally different video that you might want to look at separately, because in February 1946 on a training flight, a Lancaster bomber hit that building, clipped that building, then came down and just missed the local school, which had 80 children in, and then unfortunately crashed and killing all the crew, who were Polish crew at the time. They'd survived being in bomber command in the Second World War, only to die on a training flight. And as we walk down the road, we'll see these. We'll see a small plaque to them, and as I said on my channel, you can actually see whole videos about them called "How the Lancaster Saved the School," if you're interested in that story. So I'm just going to talk about 3 brothers from Wigston who died during the Great War. Now, that might not be that unusual in the total sense of the country, but again, remember the total population was 9,000. Obviously, many of them weren't of fighting age. So these 3 brothers died called Florian. Florian apparently is an English name that goes back to like the 13th century, and then in Leicestershire to the 13th century, and then in Wigston in particular to the start of the 19th century. But originally it was French, or even I think the origin was from Flanders in Belgium. So in one sense everything comes full circle, because these men all died in France, but of course many of the battles were also in Flanders, and there's a famous poem, Flanders Field, which features the poppy. Now that's the memorial park which we'll be visiting. So in terms of when they died, one was a second lieutenant, and he died during the Battle of the Somme in September 1916, and he was aged 30 and he wasn't married. Second brother was aged 38. He was a married man and he died in 1917. And we're just coming up to look at this plaque I mentioned a little bit earlier, and there are the crew of the Lancaster bomber that died. And at the school we'll be seeing now, when they built the school in the late 1970s, because the bomber crashed just the other side of that building, when they were digging the foundations they found remains of the bomber, and they've made a nice memorial inside the school to that crew, which again you can see on my channel if you're interested in that. As I mentioned, the second brother died. He was in the Royal Engineers. He was 38. And then the third brother died tragically. Well, they're all tragic, of course. But he died, I think, on the 4th of the 11th, 18. Just a few days before the end of the First World War. Now, after the First World War, they made this park called the Memorial Park, and the Oby and Wigston Borough Council manage it, and they do a great job. It's laid out very nicely. It's actually only a minute or 2 minutes maximum from the shopping centre, but it's actually quite a peaceful place, not that many people coming here, which is a little bit surprising, seeing how close it is. And what we'll see here is a memorial to these 3 brothers and to the other men who lost their lives. Just on a personal note, I was born in the city of Leicester in a parish called Belgrave, and my grandfather fought in the First World War, but he survived, luckily. But after the First World War, the local vicar in that parish in Belgrave said that over 50% of the fathers in that parish had died. So my grandfather was the lucky 50% who had survived, otherwise, I wouldn't be here today. So here we'll see some plaques to the fallen, and we'll view, here's a plaque specifically to the brothers I've just mentioned. Now, I'm not quite sure, but they're not actually on the main plaques. They're perhaps in other plaques in other parts of the country, maybe linked to their regiment. They were all buried in France in various locations after they died. And there is in Flanders Field where the poppies between the crosses, etc. So 3 brothers from one family. The tragedy that beheld that family But again, certainly one or two, every family had pretty much people who were in the war, and so many had casualties. There's a plaque showing the 1418 casualties and then the 3945 casualties, and that just gives a graphic illustration. Every death is tragic, of course, in any war, but the actual difference between the losses between the two wars. There is then a separate plaque. I'm not quite sure why this is, because it's basically again talking about the two wars, but with different sizes or maybe different names. But also what we should remember is that apart from the two main wars, Britain's been involved in lots of conflicts since. And certainly in the 1950s, a lot of those were with national servicemen who died. So you've got, Korea, where we lost 1,100 plus men died in that war. Maybe surprising for some, even a place like Cyprus, which is a big holiday destination for Brits these days and a great place to go. Because of the troubles there, 387 men died there. Some of them were civilians helping the local authorities, and the others were soldiers. That's actually more than in the Falklands campaign, where we lost 258. So if you're one of the people or the family that lost somebody in a conflict separate from the main wars, that loss and death is equally as bad as if they died in the major wars, of course. So this is just a little route around the park, and that just gives what's happening in the over the years in the park, and it was formed, etc., etc. Now, while I was in the park, there was a group of young men laughing and joking amongst themselves, and it did strike me that at another time in history they might have been names on that casualty board. And luckily, so far, we don't have to face that today, thank goodness. And it also came to me, there's a famous epitaph at the battlefield of Kohima. Kohima is a place in northeast India where the Japanese were attacking India and the British, Indian and Nepalese troops were trying to stop them. And it was a ferocious battle, hand-to-hand fighting with heavy casualties on both sides, which eventually the British won. But on the epitaph there's a famous one that says, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today." And that has to be the lesson, surely, of the sacrifice of all these wars. That by their deaths, they gave us all individually, and perhaps as a nation, the opportunity to do things better or to do things differently. That's what their sacrifice did. Something I think we should always remember, particularly on Remembrance Day.